Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 Episode 13. As many had speculated, this was the big one. This was possibly the best looking episode from this season. How and why did this episode look so good? Let's find out. Make sure to subscribe. This episode was directed and storyboarded by Kazuto Arai and Takumi Sunakohara. Both of them are members of the iconic Hakyugo team. Although it wasn't one of those group efforts. This episode looked fantastic. The action storyboards were insanely good. They were so ambitious and the animation kept up with them for the most part. Episode director Kazuto Arai recently released an article breaking down the production process. I will be referring to it throughout this video. The original plan for this episode involved the creation of the entire station and the restroom using CGI. Live action footage of the station was filmed and used for pre-visualization and the creation of 3D backgrounds, which is why the anime looked so lifelike. They couldn't fully realize this idea because of, you guessed it, a lack of time. I'll talk more about that in a bit. Anyway, long story short, this episode was really creative. Even the simpler scenes had a lot going on. For example, in this cut, you can see multiple shadows form and disappear depending on how close they are to the light source. Also, this shot is filmed from inside a car, with the car interior occupying part of the screen. Stuff like that adds an extra layer of complexity to these otherwise normal shots. The framing made this section more fun to look at. There's almost nothing happening here animation-wise, but the camera work and the seamless scene transitions kept things dynamic. And that brings us to the fight. And let's get a few general things out of the way first. The amount of action animation in this episode was insane. Nearly the entire episode was action. Also, the aesthetic was perfect. The color and compositing choices made by the team worked wonderfully. A bright, neon, cyberpunk-like presentation was not what I had expected, but I was pleasantly surprised. According to Arai, the lighting setup was extremely complicated and required a lot of effort. The storyboards were so well done. Yuji's vision is blocked by the wall and the anime shows that through this shadow. Once it moves above his eyes, Yuji's expression changes from a neutral one to one of shock as he can now see what's in front of him. Same goes for Chozo, although his change in expression is more dynamic and is accompanied by a zoom in for added emphasis. The amount of line work on his face exponentially increases as the camera closes in. They zoomed in on this cardiac muscle and animated the inside of an artery the same way they would animate a background. An insanely complicated shot here. The foreshortening dramatically increases, creating this three-dimensional look. Even the background work is complicated. It isn't a simple zoom out, there's a complex perspective shift. Well, it is a zoom out, but the background is drawn in a way which makes it feel like a shift in perspective took place. It messed with my brain a little. The effects are so smooth. They are animated on ones, by the way. Another insanely complicated shot. It's like the fifth one so far. It starts off as an overhead shot, but the perspective shifts as the camera closes in. The parts closer to the camera appear larger. Loved the first person shots. They made the fight more engaging. Although it would have been nice if the hand here wasn't completely still. It's a single drawing which looks a bit stiff. Similar issue with this cut. Look how good these drawings are. They last for a fraction of a second, but the detail on the fabric along with the green accents make for an amazing look. This cut is broken. It melts quite a bit. The blood flow looks really janky because of how inconsistent the drawings are. The effects animation was consistently well done. The blood generally had a single layer of shading, occasionally none, but it moved really well. Episode director Kazuto Arai did the layouts for a whopping 101 cuts, meaning most of the first half was animated by Arai, which is nuts. A solid rotation shot which made use of a 3D background. This episode did have a few awkward cuts, and this was one of them. Chozo kicking Yuji off looked quite stiff. It could have used more frames. Also, the complex angle wasn't well communicated. The fight then goes full Kannada, with the iconic Kannada light flare and the snappy timing dependent style of animation. Also, the effects look so good. The blood now has a lot of detail. There are 2 layers of shading on it. There's a small bit of background animation thrown in. It lasts for a few frames, but it's really impressive regardless. The background has this tilted perspective, which makes the flood of liquid more impactful. The blood appears to flow in the direction of the tilt, which makes it look faster. The liquid drawings go back to being simple, but the blood is constantly flowing and moving around, so it's not an issue. I'd be lying if I said this punch felt heavy, but the overall scene had this up close and personal vibe to it which I loved. Also, the head and hair movement is worth mentioning. Yuji flying away looks a bit awkward, but the complex background work that follows makes up for it. The shot composition / storyboard work is so good. Nearly every cut is dynamic and interesting to look at. Even the static scenes look creative. This ties back to Arai's original idea. Live action footage was filmed using the storyboards as a base. The 3D team then used this footage to recreate the station using CGI, and 3D layouts were constructed, which is why the scenes have a lot of depth. Very Yutaka Nakamura-like smears here, with the spiky edges. This episode really liked showing the same action from two different angles. They used this trick a lot, and it worked. It added to the overall flow. Really love this sequence. The camera mostly tracks the back of Yuji's head, so the 3D background is the main moving element, which again makes it so dynamic. Also, the 3D backgrounds look nice. They aren't too busy and the textures look good. The 3D work ate up most of the schedule according to Arai. This hindered the remaining departments. They didn't have the time to play around with the pre-visualization process and had to distribute incomplete 3D layouts. Anyway, back to the fight, the on-screen one. They snuck in a lot of first-person shots. They were present throughout this episode, which is a very Jujutsukaisen thing to do. The lighting changed here. It went from a green palette to a yellow one. And yes, they did draw inspiration from the cyberpunk anime. The lighting was a challenge for the team, and a lot of time went into specifying the direction and type of light present in each scene. This background is so good. It looks like the camera is placed on the floor. The backgrounds were mostly made using real photos and 3D layouts. If I'm understanding Arai's words correctly, a lot of tracing was involved for both the background and the foreground art, which did limit creativity. Some clever storyboards here. Chozo's ability is being explained by the signs. Love the blood loop attack. Basically everything outside of the loop is a part of the background illustration, but the stuff inside it is animated by the animator. The first person shot here looks really cool. The fact that you can see Yuji's arm interacting with its surroundings makes it so much better. Another amazing 3D background aided first person shot. Did I mention this episode had a lot of first person shots? Because it did. Those coupled with the lighting / compositing made this episode, especially this section of it, really cinematic. The compositing is so clean. The colored accents aren't overpowering. The scenes have just the right amount of color added to them. The bathroom segment was literally written to be a hand-to-hand fight. Hand-to-hand combat was the best thing about Sango Park's Jujutsu Kaisen. So, did the season 2 team do well? Yes, they did. Also, the scene needed constant water animation. They were simple white lines, but they were constantly present. It reminded me of Kizumonogatari, which is exactly the look they were going for according to Arai. They prepared 15 different water animations, mirrored them to make the total number 30, and randomly added them to the character outlines, adjusting the finer details along the way. The compositing team kept up with this idea, even when the characters were moving, which must have been complicated. Due to the tight schedule and the 3D modeling stage taking too long, the amount of time allotted to the animation process reduced, which is why you can spot a few inconsistencies throughout this episode. And that brings us to the bathroom fight. The first cut is really dynamic. It starts off with a close-up of Yuji's eye, zooms out, rotates halfway, zooms in, and then rotates again. The camera movement is obviously made possible by the 3D background. Also, the lighting looks really amazing. We get a few fixed shots with some cool looking strikes, nothing too insane, but the movement is actually animated and each individual strike is well placed. The sequence then seamlessly transitions into a first person shot using the broken mirror as a transition point. Again, consistently creative storyboards. This fight was a bit different from Park's action. It relied more on the overall presentation and the shot compositions and perspectives, while the season 1 fights generally prioritized raw choreography. Of course, that doesn't mean this fight wasn't well choreographed. The next scene, animated by Kosuke Kato for example, is really well structured and animated. The back and forth exchange is so well visualized. Every strike makes sense, so does every counter. The smears are perfectly timed and the exchange is fairly easy to read. Kato generally has a strong Kannada style, but he toned it down a bit. The scene is still quite snappy, but not as much as usual. The poses are less extreme near the start, which makes sense because this fight is supposed to be more grounded. Kato has an amazing sense of timing. Look at how long the anticipation portion of this cut is. Yuji's mouth is open for a lot of frames before a quick release, which sounded very wrong now that I think about it. The Kannada style gets more pronounced near the end, with the poses looking more distorted and exaggerated. Of course, I won't talk about every single strike, but I'll go through the more interesting ones. Some sequences flowed really well, while some didn't. The focus/zoom on Yuji was weird, since the actual action was mostly off screen. Maybe the stuff around them was too unpolished. Also, I'm not a big fan of the same strike having multiple camera cuts. I think that reduces the impact. Although I will say this, the amount of movement makes up for most of these issues. Nothing is limited. Every cut is animated. This episode nailed the fighting in a confined space vibe. It felt perfectly congested, which made up for some of the weird zooms, asymmetrical shot compositions, and unnecessary cuts. A ton of effects animation here. You have the blood, the liquid, the raindrops, and the debris. The effects really stand out because of the compositing. They pop out against the dark background, which adds to the overall aesthetic. The large amount of work that went into the stage lighting was totally worth it in my opinion. Another insane first-person shot featuring a 3D background. It never gets old. The show dropped the colored accents for this cut and went Kagenashi, aka shadowless. This is because Chozo hit the blue light source, which stopped working. We then get this money shot with a large number of frames. This is of course an obvious callback to season 1, except it ends differently. The light source is now broken, which is why some of these shots are Kagenashi. It adds an extra layer of cinematicness to this scene. There is a lot of movement here, and the camera pan adds to that. Also, lovely liquid animation. I remember a similar scene in a previous episode, which looked quite awkward. The final punch was so impactful. It's probably the most perfect looking strike so far, with a lot of frames assigned to the wind-up, followed by a quick chaotic release with a ton of wind effects. And that was the fight. It looked really good. The cyberpunk-like presentation was an added bonus, which did help hide a few imperfections. The hand-to-hand choreography was really good, although not as good as season 1, but the overall storyboard work was absolutely phenomenal. The episode isn't over though. We get this amazing shot of Sukuna. I don't really need to explain this one. Only the eyes and the red accents are visible. The rest of the body is blacked out, which makes the scene look sinister. Back-to-back aspect ratio changes, by the way. Really love this cut. Chozo's face is so expressive here. Top tier character acting. Also, the camera tracks his face, so the background is constantly shifting. We know his head is moving around frantically because we can see the background shifting behind it. This makes the scene feel more emotional. Also, the 4:3 aspect ratio is literally flickering in and out. Visual storytelling, ladies and gentlemen. And that just about does it. This was an insanely good looking episode. We now know that the team will at the very least nail the important episodes. Of course, in an ideal world, this episode would have looked even better, but sadly enough, we don't live in an ideal world. And that's about it. Did you like this video? Check out this other bit of content on screen if you did. Make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time.